Chapter 1, Mishnah 1. All right, so after a long hiatus because of being sick, Thanksgiving, and the special JTS streaming last week, we are finally back to our Mishnah class. And it's a good thing we stopped where we did because it gave us a nice break and we didn't have to forget everything, because now we're going to start a whole new chapter or a whole new Masechet, a whole new section of Mishnah. And this Mishnah we're going to look at is Megillah. Now, Megillah, of course, is talking about the holiday of Purim, but it's got a lot of by-the-way elements. That is to say, yes, we're going to cover Purim, but it's also going to fill in a lot of information about a lot of other things that are sort of, as long as we're talking about this, let's also talk about these other assorted topics. So it's not only going to be Purim stuff, but even still, it's not a very long section of Mishnah. So we should be able to get through this fairly quickly. So, we ready to start?
Yep.
Yes. All right. So we have a volunteer to read? You're a designated reader for today. All right. So we are in chapter 1, Mishnah 1.
On the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th of Adar, never earlier and never later.
Go ahead and read the next one.
Cities which have been walled since the days of Joshua ben Nun, read on the 15th. Villages and large towns read on the 14th.
And part 3, because this is all interconnected.
Except that villages move the reading up to the day of gathering.
Okay, so what in the world is being discussed here? What day of the month of Adar is Purim? The 14th, right? So that is our day. The actual day of Purim is the 14th of Adar. Unless, as it says in part 2, you're in a city, right? If you're in a city that was walled during the times of Joshua, then it's on the 15th. Right, they get special treatment, and that goes to the end of the story of Esther, where it says that Shushan continued to have the reprisals on the second day. So walled cities that are of that caliber also have the second day of Purim. Make sense so far? Yeah. Okay. The question is, how do we get with the 14th and the 15th? How do we handle the 13th, the 12th, and the 11th? How many days do we celebrate Purim?
4 days.
We don't. We don't celebrate Purim for 4 days, but the Mishnah kind of sounds like we're celebrating it for 4 days.
Yeah.
Until we get to that last section, part 3 in this printout, which is that villages up to the day of gathering. All right, so what is a day of gathering? All right, so day of gathering is not just random. The day of gathering is set. And in fact, we still know when the days of gathering used to be, because it still matters for our weekly minyan.
Monday, Thursday.
Exactly. Monday and Thursday.
Shabbat.
Well, Shabbat is also, but we don't do Purim on Shabbat. Right? So the question becomes, why do we read Torah on Monday and Thursday? And then we'll see, especially in the next Mishnah, how that affects the Megillah. But we read the Torah Monday and Thursday because those were the days when all the people who lived in the countryside came into the villages. All of them, but more people would come in on Mondays and Thursdays. Those were the market days. Those were the days when you had a crowd. And so for Torah, we said Monday, Thursday, we're going to have extra Torah readings. Because that way we can have a minyan and we can get more people to learn Torah. And that will tide us over between Shabbat, so we don't have to go a whole week without doing reading. Because again, remember, in the old days, people didn't have books. They didn't have their own copies at home. They only heard Torah when they were in the group at the synagogue. So Monday and Thursday were very important. And for reading the Megillah, the rabbis are saying we need to borrow that crowd. Because if we're in a village and the 14th is not on a Monday or Thursday, who's going to be there to hear the Megillah? What are people going to do? And so the answer is you move when you read the Megillah in order that it will come on a Monday or Thursday if the 14th of Adar isn't a Monday or Thursday. Well, let's take a look at Mishnah 2 and we're going to see exactly how that works out.
How so? If the 14th of Adar falls on Monday, the villages and large towns read on that day, and the walled places on the next day.
All right, so that's very simple. Let me get out a different color pen just so we can mark it here. Right, if this happens to be a Monday on the 14th of Adar, then bing, we won the Purim lottery, right? Get it? Purim, lottery, lots, poor. Anyway, it wasn't a great joke. Already a day of gathering. So small towns, they've already got it for the right day. And larger towns, they've got it for the right day. And the big walled cities, they do tomorrow anyway, right? Because that's just how it works. Good. But part two.
If it falls on Tuesday or on Wednesday, the villages move the reading up to the day of gathering. The large towns read on that day, and the walled places on the next day.
Okay, so regular city, you're going to read it if it's a Tuesday or if it's a Wednesday, you'll read it on the 14th of Adar. And the big walled cities, of course, are reading it on the 15th of Adar. Cities, I mean, not the cities, the other towns, the small villages, when are they going to read it?
And every day that falls on Monday.
On the Monday. If this is a Tuesday, that's going to be the Monday. But it could be, if this was a Wednesday, that was the Monday. So you could be reading in your little village the Megillah 2 days earlier than the holiday.
Okay.
Following it so far?
That was acceptable.
Not only acceptable, it's required.
Okay.
Right? That if you're in this small village, that is the day you have to read it in order that you can read it with the community and be able to fulfill the mitzvah of reading from the Megillah. So we're going to talk about, by the way, what large and small towns mean. But if you live in one of these small towns, that was what you did. It wasn't a permitted, it was a required.
Okay.
Make sense? Okay, another permutation.
If it falls on Thursday, the villages and large towns read on that day, and the walled places on the next day.
Right? If it's Thursday, bing, 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 it's already a day of gathering. It works out perfectly for everyone. Small, middle, large. Good. Onward.
If it falls on Friday, the villages move the reading up to the day of gathering, and the large towns and walled places read on that day.
Falling on Friday, then that's no problem. Remember, when it's falling on Friday, what they're talking about here is you would have the reading Thursday night, and then in the morning on Friday day, because of the way the Jewish calendar works. It's not you're reading Friday night and then having Purim on Shabbat.
Yeah.
So, and then if you're a little town, you would read on your Thursday on the day before. Make sense so far?
Yeah.
So far, we've only gone back 2 days to fix this.
Mhm.
But let's keep going.
About the villages and large towns move the reading up to the day of gathering, and the walled places read the next day.
All right,
So it have to be Thursday then, right?
okay, but notice now villages and large towns are moving it back to Thursday. And if it is a walled city, then you can wait until Sunday and read then. Making sense so far? Right? Very logical, but they work out all the permutations. Okay, and the last version.
If it falls on Sunday, the villages move the reading up to the day of gathering. The large towns read on that day, and the walled cities on the day following.
Friday and Thursday. So now, if it falls on Sunday, then big cities and walled cities are doing just fine. We can't back up to Shabbat. We can't back up to Friday. We have to back up all the way to Thursday, the 11th of Adar, in order to read if it was going to fall out on a Sunday. Make sense? Okay.
And then the walled cities do it on.
And the walled cities are still here on the 15th. Right. So this is always the wall. Now, who here has ever gone to an early Purim reading? Have you ever even heard of this? Right? Before you read this Mishnah, had you ever heard of having Purim 4 days early? No. And why not? Because of Mishnah 3. Okay, so let's move on to Mishnah 3.
What is considered a large town? One which has in it 10 idle men.
Go ahead and read part A.
One that has fewer is considered a village.
Okay, so if you have a minyan of people who live in the town that are free for going to minyan, going for services, you're a large town. Right. If you have a minyan always available, right? Not a minyan like only at night when the men come in from the field, right? Not a minyan like only on Mondays and Thursdays, but you've got a minyan of 10 guys that the town is big enough that there are 10 people that are able to,
Hang around the shul.
that can hang around the shul. It's exactly that, right? Or the Beit Midrash, they're in the house of study, or they're in the shul, right? But these guys, you can call them if you need a minyan, that they're there. They're not at their jobs, so they're available. Then you're a large town. You have 100,000 people, 50,000 people. If you've got 20 people, but 10 of them are a minyan and they're always available, you're a big town. Oh, someone at the door. Oh, that's had to pick up the thing. I got it. I'm already moving.
Okay.
With that, y'all.
So Orlando, what Orlando? It's a big town or nothing? Big town. Yeah, we have 10 always.
Even no, the village would be many. We would be
Okay.
considered here a big village.
Okay, so Orlando.
We were
We're
talking
just
about.
What's our status?
Definitely have to
You
be
know
a big
better than
town.
us. You have 10 hanging around it.
Do you think that if we needed 10 people for a minyan, we could get 10 people for a minyan, or do you think that the people would say, man, I can't, I've got work?
I think you can if probably somebody make the effort. Hold it, probably. I'm available.
Right. We have never missed a minyan in Orlando for any of the services that I've been to for Purim. We've never had a problem getting a minyan. So yes, at least for this purposes, we're a large enough town. Right. Now, if you were like just Castleberry, right, maybe that might be a little harder to find 10 people that would automatically be available for any service. But yeah, Orlando is definitely a big enough town by this definition, Jewishly.
And I think because of the nature of this holiday, because it's not mostly, but this holiday.
It's fun, yeah.
They bring the parents with them.
Sometimes the parents bring the kids, sometimes the kids bring the parents.
Parents, yeah.
Right, but remember, maybe we do a whole class on Purim sometime. Purim is a very adult holiday. I know we may act like it's a kid's holiday because we're a bit silly, but it's really a very mature theme. There's another reason why you never hear about this, and that's because of this. Monday, Thursday, do we have more people hanging around?
Yeah.
No one comes to Orlando on Monday for the market day. No one comes here on Thursday from the hillside, coming into the town from their farms, carrying their bags of beans that they're going to sell. So if you don't have Monday and Thursday as a day of actual gathering, then why would you move? Why would you move the Megillah reading? There's no reason to move it. We're only moving it early in order to catch the crowd, to help them fulfill the mitzvah. But if the crowd doesn't come on Mondays and Thursdays, then we might as well do it on the actual day. There's no reason to move it, to advance it. Of our history for the last few thousand years, in most places, this has not been practiced. Exactly. It's on the books, it's officially allowed, but it's not usually been an issue. If you were perhaps doing some late winter retreat camp and you only had 5 of you and you knew that the janitor was going to show up and the caterer was going to show up and you'd have more people on the day before actually, then maybe you might use this. But for the most part, however, it is a wonderful way to open up another topic of conversation, and that's part 3. So we're changing subjects, but not changing subjects. Number 3.
But with regard to the bringing the wood for the priest, the fast of Tish B'Av, the Hagiga, and assembling the people, they postpone until after Shabbat, and they do not move them up.
Okay, so here's the contrast before we get into what are these other categories, which is for other things in Jewish law, other holidays and events, we will postpone them. So if it normally would fall out on Shabbat, not Purim, but for example, Tisha B'Av. If Tisha B'Av normally would fall on Shabbat, we don't commemorate it on Shabbat. We commemorate it on the next day, right? Sunday, exactly. So we postpone it one day. which makes us wonder, why are we postponing these other things, but we don't postpone Purim? Why not just push Purim to why not, if Purim was supposed to be on the 14th and that was Wednesday, why not just do it on Thursday, right? Why go back 2 days to Monday? And this is what's being discussed here. Now, they don't say in the Mishnah why they don't, but in the Gemara, they explain what's going on here. And it has to do, if you look at your notes, you can see there's the quote from Esther 9, verse 27, where literally it says that when we accepted upon ourselves the mitzvah of Purim to commemorate this day, that we would not let it pass without observing it, without doing the holiday. And since the literal term is we wouldn't let it go by, then we can't postpone, right? Because when we accepted it, we said we won't let the day pass. So once the 14th comes, the opportunity is gone, right? You can't go to the 15th if you're not in a big city, the walled city, and you can't go to the 16th if you're in a walled city. You have to do it on the 14th, whereas for all the other ones, the obligation begins on that day, and you can then postpone it if necessary because of Shabbat. So let's just do a quick run through of what these other issues are, so that we can at least fill in the blanks. So Tisha B'Av, of course, is the day of commemoration that falls during the summer. When we commemorate the worst tragedies of our people, it's a day of fasting and a day of sadness. That we can put off one day if it's to avoid Shabbat, because we don't have those feelings on Shabbat. The Hagiga is the additional sacrifice that was brought for Yom Tov, for the festivals. And that, because you could do it anytime during the week of the festival, you can put off and do it during the weekday rather than doing it on Shabbat. The people, this is actually referring to the sabbatical assembly, the every 7 years when you would bring people together to have them hear the whole Torah being read. That as well was put off from Shabbat. A number of different reasons of why that would have been put off, because you might think that reading from the Torah is not really a problem. Partly, some people suggest it's because they had to build the bleachers for people to stand on and to listen to the Torah being read. Other people say it's because you're not allowed to carry your children without an eruv, and therefore you don't want to do it on Shabbat, lest the children not come, because you want them to hear this once every 7 year event. No, it's one of the things that's dependent on the temple, and since the temple doesn't stand, we have instead taken it upon ourselves to read the whole Torah every year rather than every 7 years. Part 4 is going to add a little tweak to this.
Although they said that they should be moved up but not postponed, it is permissible to mourn, to fast, and to distribute gifts to the poor on these earlier days.
Okay, so let's go back to our map here of days. Let's imagine this is a Wednesday, which means we're actually going to be reading on a Monday, right? We got our model here. So I'm reading here, but Purim is here. Now on Purim, right, we no fasting, no mourning, and we give gifts to the poor and all those other mitzvot, right? So the question is, especially about the no fasting and no mourning, does that apply to this day, to my substitute day? Do I also have to not mourn, not fast on that Monday, really Purim? And the answer is no. You don't have to fast. You shouldn't. You shouldn't refrain from fasting or mourning on that day if it is otherwise appropriate. So if you have to bury somebody on that Monday, you do the normal mourning practices, where they are a little different if you have to bury somebody on Purim. So the reading is just for the reading. It doesn't cancel the other aspects of the day, and it doesn't fulfill the whole holiday either. There's a debate about the gifts for the poor, the matanot le'evyonim, about whether or not we do those on the Monday or whether we do those on the 14th. Most agree that you could do it on either, and if you've done it once, you don't have to do it again. So that's kind of the compromise that's there. Good? All right, part 5.
Rabbi Judah said, when is this so? in a place where people gather on Mondays and Thursdays, but in places where people do not gather on Mondays and Thursdays, the Megillah is read only on its proper day.
Welcome to the modern world, right? So Rabbi Yehuda points out what we were discussing before, that, yeah, we don't gather on Monday and Thursday in the same way. We still have minyan, of course. We still read Torah, of course. But it's not like the people from the villages are coming into the town on these days. So therefore, it's not a gathering day. So we would never move Purim just because we thought it was easier. It's kind of important because sometimes people say, well, you know, if it's a weekend, maybe more people will come. Why don't we move Purim to Saturday night, Sunday, rather than a weekday? Because that way we'll get a bigger crowd. No, Purim is when Purim is. If it was a built-in gathering that people were already coming and otherwise it's hard for them to walk from their farm all the way to the village and so they're not doing it every day, then we make accommodations. But just because people are inconvenienced by coming on a Tuesday night rather than a Saturday night, no, that's not how we move. I mean, people can get in their car and drive. This is not an issue. No one's walking for a day to come on that time to hear the Megillah. They don't need to, right? They got a car at the very least. So we can do it rather than adjusting it. So we don't fiddle with Purim. Make sense? Okay. More on our reading calculations.
If they read the Megillah during the first Adar and the year was interpolated, a month was added, it is read again in the second Adar.
Okay, so odd situation that used to be more common, never happens now, which is you can get 2 months of Adar. Now, yes, we still have 2 months of Adar, but it's different. It's not quite the same. So this is the way it used to be. And back in the day, you would be going through winter, and it would be time for the month of Adar, and you would have your month of Adar, and then the very, very smart people would look at the sky, and they'd look at the sun, and they would look at the calendar, and they'd say, you know, Pesach is going to come too early. So we need another month before Pesach gets here. That's what's known as intercalating. What's that? Exactly, but it wasn't decided in advance. It was decided that year at that month in Adar. So it's kind of like they would choose to do a bonus month. But the problem is they might choose to do the bonus month after they've already had Purim. So you've had Purim, yay, we read the Megillah, boo, Haman, all that stuff. And then they look at the math and they go, the equinox, it's coming too late. We need to wait another month before we have Passover. Otherwise, Passover is coming before the equinox, and then we're in trouble. We need to wait again. Okay, so now when Adar 14 comes around, well, the second Adar 14 comes around, we do it again. we have Purim all over again. Right. Now, nowadays, it's not an issue for us because our calendars have already been calculated months years in advance, 1,500 years now in advance. So we've already got it laid out. We know exactly when Purim is going to be. We're not surprised by adding a month. So we never do Purim twice in the full Megillah kind of way.
It's just they note it.
Yeah, we note it in the calendar, but we don't actually observe Purim 100% each time. They go on to point out then that there's no difference, part 2.
Between the first Adar and the second Adar, except the reading of the Megillah and the giving of gifts to the poor. What about the fasting and stuff? You do that or no?
No, there's no difference.
There's no difference.
Right.
So you're doing the same thing.
Right, it is the same thing, right? So that is, so the prohibition on fasting in the morning, it is still prohibited to fast or mourn on the first Adar and the second Adar. Right, that is the same. And in fact, it's that phrasing, there is no difference between ... That's going to take us down our tangent. Right, ready to go down the rabbit hole? Okay, because we're now going to hit a lot of different topics. So for the moment, take your Purim hat, set it to one side. We'll come back to Purim before the end of the chapter, but for quite a few Mishnayot, we are not going to be talking about Purim. Okay. Other things where there is no difference except.
There is no difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov except the preparation of food.
All right, very good thing to remember. When it comes to melacha, when it comes to the work on Shabbat that we are prohibited from doing, there is no difference. So you can't write on Shabbat, you can't write on Sukkot, on a festival day. It's prohibited on both days, except for the preparation of food. For cooking, for Yom Tov, for the day of the holiday itself, yes, you can cook on the day for the day, right? You can't cook your bakery's food and sell it next week, but you can cook for that day. And that has to do with the way the Torah has a very clever writing about saying that one person, you can cook what is needed for them. And that is an exception to the usual limits on what you can do. But in all other respects, Shabbat and Yom Tov are the same. So sometimes it's important to point out what's the same and then the exception. It's just easier to do it that way. Make sense?
There is no difference between Shabbat and Yom Kippurim.
Which is the fancier Mishnah way of saying Yom Kippur.
Except that the deliberate violation of the one is punished by a human death. The deliberate violation of the other is by karet.
Right. So, and it talks about the breaking of these holidays. If a person deliberately breaks Shabbat, says, I hate Shabbat, I don't like Shabbat, I'm going to go and write on Shabbat, that is, and there are witnesses and all the other legalities, that's handled by a human court. But if someone says, I hate Yom Kippur, and I'm going to break Yom Kippur, and they go write on Yom Kippur, which is also forbidden, they're not punished by the human court the same way that they would be by breaking Shabbat. Instead, they are punished by karet. Now, karet is considered to be the punishment at the hands of heaven. So you still did something wrong, and in fact, karet is considered worse than when you are punished by a human court. But it's not going to be handled by the court, it's going to be handled by God.
Why would they separate it? I think that Yom Kippur would be almost as bad as Shabbat.
It's worse. It is. Yeah. Right. So being punished by karet is worse than being punished by the court. So we often think the court, the humans, the people who can actually make my life miserable or take my life, that's the biggest deal. More worried about people than we are about God. For Yom Kippur, we are reminded, no, the biggest thing to be worried about is God. And yes, it's taken over and it's in God's hands rather than the court's hands, but that should make you more worried about what you're doing, not more relaxed. And so karet is considered the bigger punishment, and therefore you should not be breaking Yom Kippur even more than not breaking Shabbat.
I think it's because people don't understand really what karet is. You know, a lot of people don't understand what it is.
So karet literally means to be cut off, right? To be excised is sort of the fancy English word from it. And what it's talking about here is not only the physical punishment that happens to the person, but it's like the soul is being pushed away from God, which should be a much bigger threat to us than whatever any court could do. But because it's not seen with our own eyes, because we don't see the judge, we don't see the jury, well, not the jury, we don't see the Beit Din, we don't see the witnesses, we don't see the punishment, it's not as real to us. And you know, that there's an unfortunate flipping of what's important and what's less important. They're both important. So, all right. So with that in mind, we're still going to move on with our there's no different clusters.
There is no difference between one who is prohibited by vow from benefiting from his fellow and one who is prohibited by vow from benefiting from his food, except in the matter of setting a foot on his property and of vessels which are not used for preparing food.
Okay. Imagine you're really, really angry at your neighbor. I mean, really angry from your neighbor. So angry that you take a vow that you will never, ever benefit from this person ever again. Now, not just a vow like what I just said, but I mean a true, has all the weight of I am promising, I'm swearing between myself and God that this is what is going to happen. I am now making his benefit from him as though I were murdering someone, right? So I will avoid doing that the same way that I would avoid breaking any commandments. You're basically creating a new commandment just for you in your vow. Now, the rabbis are not recommending this behavior. Sometimes other vows could be done for good reasons. This doesn't sound like a great reason. But the question is, if I vow I will never benefit from, or I vow I will never benefit from Frank's food, what's the difference, right? What's the distinction between them? If it comes time for dinner, both vows apply, right? If it comes time for him to give me a chicken, both vows apply. If it comes time for me to walk through his yard, only one of them matters, right? If I say I'll never benefit from his food, I can still take a shortcut. If I say I'll never benefit from him, I can't even walk into his property. And likewise, if he has a hammer that has nothing to do with food, if I vowed never to benefit from him, I can't touch his hammer. But if I vowed never to benefit from his food, I can use his hammer. So there's just a slight distinction for certain circumstances between the two. So it's one more way of highlighting the importance of some small details that can have...
Wording.
Yeah, the wording can have some big differences. Similarly, two things that look very, very similar but have real differences. Part 2.
There is no difference between vowed offerings and free will offerings, except that he is responsible for vowed offerings, but not responsible for free will. Okay, so if a person brings or vows to bring an animal, as an offering, then if something happens to the animal, like I say, I vow to bring a cow to the offering, right, to the temple, and the cow that I'm going to bring gets hit by lightning, I still have to bring a cow, a different cow, not the same cow, but I still have to bring a cow. I'm not off the hook because I vowed that I would bring a sacrifice. But on the other hand, if it's a free will offering, and I've just said, you know what, I'm going to take this cow to the temple, and I'm going to sacrifice this cow at the temple because I just want to say thank you to God. And cow, okay, I'm not going to take the cow, and I don't have to replace the cow. I don't need a substitute. So the difference is saying it's vowed.
Saying it's vowed and saying that you're vowing an offering, as opposed to saying I'm going to, right? Yeah, this animal. Specific. Right. This animal, if it becomes disqualified, I'm off the hook. But vowing to do an offering, I have to do an offering. Now, I may have been thinking about this animal, but if that animal is disqualified, I still have to fulfill my vow of an offering.
Thinking doesn't count.
Thinking doesn't count. Exactly right. That's right. That's the phrase that's used, "Devarim shebelev einam devarim," right? Matters that are in your heart, meaning you don't say them, but you're just thinking them. The heart isn't only emotion; it's also the place of thinking in biblical poetry. It doesn't count, right? Well, that's not what I was thinking. Like, yeah, but that's what you did, right? What you say, what you do is much more important than just what you think about what you say and what you do. It's the external makes the bigger difference. All right. Mishnah 7, same theme, very different set of topics.
There is no difference between a zav who sees genital discharge twice and one who sees 3 except the sacrifice. Okay, not a topic that comes up a lot, right? So a zav in Jewish law is a man who has had an unexpected and unusual leakage from his man pieces, or man piece, I guess you'd say, right? Hopefully there's only one way for it to leak. So in Leviticus, in Vayikra, it talks about this situation the same way that it also talks about a woman who has an unexpected and irregular leakage from her places. And the rule is the same between the two. Once you see it, you have to start counting 7 days. And if it keeps going, then you keep counting. But what's the difference between if you see it first day, you see it second day, and then you just go clean days? Or what happens if you see it first day, second day, third day, and then you go clean days? The only difference is a sacrifice.
If you see it first day, second day, clean days, then you go to the mikveh and you're fine. You see it first, second, third, and then clean days, you go to the mikveh and bring a sacrifice, and then you're fine. So if it happened 3 days, then you would bring a sacrifice, which was usually turtle doves, the small birds. So we're not talking about a whole cow here for this. So, make sense? The distinction? Okay, not something that comes up all that often. Part 2. This comes up even less.
Speech from a Metzora who is under observation and one declared to be a definite Metzora, except this
disheveling
of hair and tearing the clothes.
Okay, so the Metzora is the one that's the skin problem that's usually defined as leprosy. It's not really leprosy, but that's what the translation usually is, because for some reason they thought just leaving the word Metzora was unusual. I would have been much happier if they just said Metzora and then we said it's Metzora. That's just a new thing. Doesn't happen anymore, but it did happen back in the days of the tabernacle and the temple. So there are 2 ways or 2 stages to being declared a Metzora, and you might become might be different in between, right? It might be canceled in the middle. So if you are somebody who they think, the priests think has Metzora, you go to the priest, you say, hey, check this out. The priest looks at it, says, that looks like Metzora. You have to be in quarantine for 7 days. And then somebody who comes to the priest and says, hey, is this Metzora? They say, yeah, that's Metzora. 7 days, or the signs are clearer. Then what's the difference between them? Well, if you're in quarantine, meaning you're suspected because it looks like it probably is, then they don't do the shoveling of the hair, the letting the hair loose, and they don't rend the clothes. If you are definitely declared to be Metzora, then you do. So that's our distinction.
Because you could be separated.
Well, you're separated in both cases, but so that's and the rules regarding purity and other things are the same in both cases. But you don't have to do the hair and you don't do the tearing until you are definitely declared to be a Metzora. So otherwise, they are the same 2 things. Make sense? Okay, so small difference, small implications. Onward.
There is no difference between Metzora who has been declared clean after being under observation and one who has been declared clean after having been a definite Metzora, except shaving and sacrificing the birds.
Okay, so in all other ways, they come out of this the same, and they have to go through the same ritual, except if you were only declared clean after observation, you don't have to do the shaving and you don't have to bring the sacrifice. If you were declared clean after you had been declared definitely a Metzora, then you do have to do the shaving and you do have to do the bird sacrifice.
When you say shaving, is shaving the head?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. The legs all that much. Okay? Okay, like I said, this is a real cluster of different topics, of 2 things that are very similar with some distinction. What's that? Well, remember, because we began with Megillah way back when, get back to in Megillah 4, where the difference between the first Adar and the second Adar is just ... right? So that's why we started this, the difference between A and B, or there is no difference between A and B except C. Language and the Mishnah is just using that same language over and over again. This was considered a mnemonic device, that you could remember this list of A equals C except for C, or A equals B except for C over and over again, that would make it easier to remember that pattern of ideas.
That sounds like my logic. College.
Well, yes. All right, so now we are on Mishnah 8.
There is no difference, different scrolls of the Tanakh and Tefillin and mezuzahs, except that scrolls may be written in any language, whereas Tefillin and mezuzahs may be written only in Assyrian.
All right, so let's walk this one from the backwards forward. What do you mean we're writing in Assyrian? Right? I thought we wrote in Hebrew,
Yeah.
right? And we write in Assyrian.
Really?
Well, we write
For the
in
mezuzahs and
for everything. Our Torah is written in Assyrian. Font.
Oh.
All right. So after we came back from Bavel, right, after we came back from the Babylonian exile, we brought with us their font, because Hebrew prior to that was written very differently. The letters were more like hard lines and angles. It wasn't the curves and the shapes that we now know. I mean, it was totally different. You can look up early Hebrew online and you can see what it looks like. You can find coins that used to exist and inscriptions and other things that were written in Old Hebrew. And I remember the first time I was learning Hebrew, you know, I was like really proud of myself, and I was looking at a magazine of biblical archaeology, and there's a coin, and they say, this says, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I look at the coin, like, where's an aleph? Like, I can't see a single letter here, because the font was totally different. When we came back from Babylon, we brought with us this script, this font. We didn't change the words. We didn't change the letters. We just changed the font. It's like if you've ever been in a word processor, right? And you just select the paragraph and you change, you know, Times New Roman to Arial to whatever you want, Comic Sans. It changes the font, and sometimes it'll look totally different. Like, you know, if you change it to Wingdings, crazy. But the actual letters underneath are still the same. And if you could read Wingdings, you could still read the words. And that's what we did. We changed the font, but we didn't change the text, because the font, the biblical, the pre-font, the earlier font, was easier for inscriptions, easier for carving, terrible for a pen. Whereas the new font wasn't so easy to inscribe, but much easier to write. And so it was literally a godsend for us to be able to write much more easily, to disseminate Jewish knowledge, and to be able to spread that, to use the font that we brought back with us from the Babylonian captivity. And we call it the Assyrian script. So we just changed the font. Now let's work backwards still. If you're making tefillin or mezuzah, you have to use that script, and it has to be in Hebrew. Right? So if you open up any mezuzah case, it'll be in Hebrew. It's not going to say, "Hear, O Israel," in English. It's going to say Shema Yisrael in Hebrew, and it's going to be written in that font. Both the Shema as well as for the tefillin, it says these words, right? Which we take to be very straightforward. Those words in Hebrew, in that font, need to be included in our tefillin or in our mezuzah. Technically, we're going to come back to that in the second half, but technically could be written in French. And by Torah, I don't mean the Chumash. I mean the Torah scroll could be written in a different language. You could write it in Portuguese, you could write it in Russian, you could write it in Chinese, and you could use that Torah for study and for the Bima.
You can read it?
Could. Right. So again, this is Mishnah, not Halacha L'Maaseh, right? This is Mishnah, not what we do today. And I'll work you through the history of why we don't in just a second. But at the time of the Mishnah, yes, if you had a Chinese Torah and you read Chinese and it was an accurate Torah, you could read from the Bima in Chinese. And that would have been considered to be a proper kosher Torah. You couldn't have a Chinese mezuzah. You can have the outside be Chinese, but not the inside scroll. You can't have Chinese tefillin, but you could have a Chinese Torah. However, now we get, and the same thing, by the way, for like, you know, Yechezkel, for Ezekiel, or Megillah Ruth, the story of Ruth, or the story of Purim. Those could have also been written in French, Russian, whatever. However, part 2.
Then Cavalier says that scrolls of the Tanakh were permitted by the sages to be written only in Greek.
Okay, Greek. So they said, not so fast. You know, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, you can't write it in Chinese, you can't write it in Russian, you can't write it in English. Not that they knew about English then, because English didn't exist then. There was no English. English is a new language. But you can write it in Greek. So if you had a Greek Torah or a Greek copy of Megillat Esther, that would be a kosher copy. Or a Hebrew one, of course, right? So Hebrew or Greek. Now, why would Greek get special treatment? Septuagint, right? So according to our story, when Ptolemy was in Egypt and wanted to have a copy of the Torah written, and translated into Greek. He took 70 scholars, he put them in 70 separate rooms, and he had each of them write their own translation, and all of their translations matched. It's a miracle. And that,
I remember that story.
Yeah, and that gives a little extra boost to the Greek version, right? It's not just what you think it says. It's not your translation, his translation. You know, with all the other languages, there's a real problem with translation of how accurate is it. I mean, if you've ever read through more than one English version of the Torah, you'll know that sometimes the translation can make a big difference.
Yeah.
So for the Greek,
well, because when you actually go back to like even today when we were talking about when Joseph,
yes,
you know, he was like basically the leader of the,
which is much more obvious in the Hebrew than it is in the English translation.
English, yeah.
Right. So the idea was, because the Greek had this special status, yes, a Greek Torah could be considered a public Torah that could be used for ceremonies. But other ones you could use to study, but you shouldn't use on the Bima. Now, that leads me to the question, why don't we have a Greek Torah? You're not going to find a Greek Torah on a scroll anywhere, or a Greek copy of Ruth or anything else for that matter. There's an argument made by Rambam that the Greek that we have now is not the same Greek that the Septuagint was written in. And so even though we might have the Greek of the Septuagint, the language has shifted, and therefore it's not the same as it was originally meant. Now, that, if you are a familiar student of English, should be very familiar. Right? When you read Shakespeare, he uses some words that are different than the words that the same word means now. Right? The meaning of the word has drifted, and that's only 500 years. And this, we're looking at more than 2,000 years. So, yeah, Greek, even if we have the original Greek, we can't be 100% sure that the words mean exactly what we think they mean just because we know modern Greek. It's not 100% the same. And so therefore we don't use Greek for our Torahs now. But it's still kind of fun to imagine, you know, getting up there and having someone read the Torah in Greek. It's just would be kind of cool. But you know what? Hebrew's a lot easier for me than Greek. So no thank you. Although Greek has vowels, that would be handy. All right, Mishnah 9.
There is no difference between a priest anointed with the oil of anointment and one who only wears the additional garments except for the bull, which is offered for the unwitting transgression of any of the commandments.
Okay, again, a little bit of history. In the old days, meaning First Temple period, in this particular case, it happened before Josiah, King Josiah. There was a special oil that was described in the Torah that was used to appoint the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. That oil recipe was put away and lost, no longer used. Let's say no longer used. Otherwise, it's a whole other discussion. So now, after that time, the Kohen Gadol doesn't have the oil. He wasn't anointed with that oil. So what's the difference, right? Is he still the real Kohen Gadol? Is he still able to do Yom Kippur? Is he still able to do all of the jobs of the Kohen Gadol? He does still, and that's why they talk about the clothing. He would still wear more of the special garments than the other regular Kohanim, even though he didn't get the oil. He was still especially dressed. Again, going back to our class today about how clothes give the rank, just like with Joseph and his coat. And the answer is yes, he's the same, except for the bull that is offered. Now, there's way back at the very beginning of the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, there's a whole little section, it's like chapter 4, I think, 3, 4, right around there, 4, 5, talking about when the high priest makes a mistake and has to then seek atonement for his mistake. That they don't do. So the oil priest could do that, the non-oil priest couldn't. That's the only difference. Otherwise, they're the same, right? The job is not changed just because the oil is missing. Good? Good. All right. Part 2 of that page.
There is no difference between a serving high priest and one whose time has passed, except the bull of the Yom HaKippurim and the 10th of the Ephah.
Okay, so if you were a Kohen Gadol and then you retire and there's a new Kohen Gadol, what's the difference between Kohen Gadol and past Kohen Gadol? No difference, right? The past Kohen Gadol is still treated with the same respect, reverence, and everything else, except he can't do the Yom Kippur service.
Oh, the new one?
The new one does it, but not the old one, right?
Oh,
Only the appointed Kohen Gadol for that year gets to go into the Holy of Holies and do the Yom Kippur service. The daily offering of the ephah, the 10th of an ephah of flour, that too, only the current Kohen Gadol could do. Right? So they were pretty much the same, except for those two little pieces. Well, not that Yom Kippur is little, but you know.
So he was really not retired then.
Well, no, he still had his status as Kohen. Now that doesn't mean that he was working every day. You know, maybe he was in Florida. But as far as his legal status went, and as far as how he was treated and what he could do, there was no difference between the two of them. So you can't really stop being Kohen Gadol-ish.
Yeah.
But yes, these two jobs.
Is this really practical? Because I thought only time that you become Kohen Gadol is when the previous one, like Aaron died,
Right.
his son was appointed. That's what I thought.
Theoretically, yes. But theoretically as well, some Kohen Gadol would probably have lived long enough to not be able to do the job well anymore.
Okay.
Right, and to step down. Well, and they could have stepped down for any reason. Would have been another possible reason why it might happen.
Did it happen? There is a
I don't remember. I remember histories of the Kohen Gadols dying. Problem with that during the Herodian time, but as in no Yom Kippur no Kohen Gadol saw two Yom Kippurs, which means once they became Kohen Gadol, they didn't last 2 years. Yeah, short life expectancy because they were corrupt. It was during Herod, it was a political position. And so people bought it because they thought it would bring their family prestige and also be lucrative. And that's the wrong reason. And you go step in front of the Holy of Holies with that as your attitude. Yeah, it's you get fired, literally. So yeah, they
This is why the two sons of Elazar, that they died in fire because
yes. Well,
fire.
a little bit different. I mean, the story of the Kohanim that were dying during the corrupt period is really a story about how politics and religion don't mix. Right? It's the political game corrupts religion, and people who think they're right religiously will warp the politics, which is what we see from the Sadducees, who were trying to use politics to put down the opponents religiously. So it's politics and religion should stay apart. Something to remind ourselves of just a little bit as we are getting ready to celebrate the story of Hanukkah, where we won the war, or we won the battle, but we lost the war. Because the Hashmoneans, the Maccabees, when they took over, they were Kohanim, they were priests. And when they took over, they also became the kings. And you can't be from Judah and Aaron at the same time. So they allowed themselves to have that of power as being both the high priest and being the king. And their family became very corrupt very quickly. And that's what brought Roman. Was our own weakness because of that corruption. 2 or 3 generations, they had already fallen apart as a leading family. So they won the battle. They freed us from the Seleucids. They were able to restore the temple, and then when they had to govern, they lost it. So there's a cautionary tale there. All right. Yeah, we got time for one more. Mishnah 10.
The difference between a great altar and a small altar, except for the Pesach offering.
Okay. There was a time when people could have their own small altars. Right? There was a time when, well, yes, when not every offering had to be done in Jerusalem. It's a very complicated history, which I'm not going to get into tonight. But eventually, yes, all worship was localized in Jerusalem, and that was done. But even when that was open, even when there was small altars and the great altar, meaning the altar of Jerusalem, for Passover, you were still at the great altar, right? You could do other things at the small ones, but Passover you still had to come together.
We talked about this.
A few years ago,
Yeah.
yes.
We talked about this.
Yes.
It was some point.
Yes, it was on again, off again.
Yeah.
Right. That's why I say it's complicated. It was like before we settled, then after we settled, there was disruption. Then it was safe again. Then it wasn't safe. So there were times when we were allowed. But by the time the rabbis are talking, and by the time the Mishnah is being written, well, before the Mishnah, but by the time the oral law is being really pulled together, we already were no longer doing small altars.
So did they have the priest come to?
You still needed a Kohen. Yes, you still needed a Kohen. But remember, not every Kohen lived in Jerusalem.
Okay.
The Kohens took
So you could get the local Kohen
Right.
and be able to be at each people's houses, or is there a specific like a synagogue?
No, it could be yours. It could be a regions. It didn't. There were lots of them. Well, focus on it very much. But when you read through different sections of the Tanakh, so for example, Manoach, Samson's father, he and his wife, when they are greeting the angel, and the angel's given them the notice that their son is going to be born and blah, 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 they offer up a sacrifice at the end. I was like, where did this happen? They were in Dan. They weren't in Jerusalem. How are they? Because at that period, because of the disruption, they were allowed to do those things. Yeah. So, all right. Part 2.
This is the general principle. Any animal which can be brought as a vow offering or a free will offering may be brought on a small altar. Any animal which is not the object of a vow or a free will offering may not be brought at a small altar.
Okay. So if there was a required sacrifice, then you were also going to Jerusalem, which is really kind of a subline of the Passover thing. So Passover is sort of a stand-in of, if it's required, you got to go to Jerusalem or Shiloh or where every other place that the temple stood, the altar stood before Jerusalem was built. Excuse me. But if it was a celebration, free will offering, or you made a vow, to God to make an offering, those could be offered at these small altars. So really the phrase Passover offering is kind of a stand-in for a longer list of different types of offerings. Make sense? Makes sense. All right. We're going to call it there for tonight.
Actually, in the introduction for this Mishnah, they actually explain